With AI, we fear it might overpower us, it might outcompete us, threaten our very existence as people. We also fear bad agents having more power with AI to go about their things. Misinformation campaigns, bioweapon design, more bad stuff in the world. Now, most of us have this anxiety towards AI one way or another, and in bigger or smaller amounts. I myself for sure have plenty. But then most of us don't really act on it. We observe, we are curious, and we like to know as much as possible, but we don't really feel like we can face it. But there is a group of people that makes it its purpose to actually face the anxiety and try to protect us from potential AI harm. This group of people is a relatively small community and is a very smart community working on AI safety. They are the ones that specialize in the research and development of solutions that are supposed to protect us. They focus on building the solutions to prevent bad things from happening. They are trying to minimize the chances of that. And they are trying to educate us as well, us, the public, the receivers, the users, in order to make us more aware of the dangers that are actually out there. In today's episode, I am speaking to a person that belongs to this group, Seraphina Goldfarb-Tarrant. She has a PhD in fairness for NLP. She has a commercial experience working for tech companies, specifically for Google in the ad tech department. She is a beautiful mind, and she is head of AI safety at Cohere, where we met. Working at Cohere, she co-authored the Enterprise Guide to AI Safety that I'm going to link in the show notes. And you could recently see her in Davos, rubbing shoulders with AI legends, sitting next to Young LeCun and Max Tegmark and talking about AI, danger, and safety. Seraphina is a very colorful figure. The first part of our conversation involves discussing her inspirations from studying Greek and Roman cultures, the practice of Zen, becoming a professional sailor, and spending over 1 year sailing across the North Sea. In the second part, we are talking about her research in NLP, gender bias, and fairness. We are talking about impressions from old school NLP versus large language model advancements and how the field has changed. We are discussing what it's like to hack language models, or white hack, at DEFCON in Vegas. We are also discussing the nightmare scenarios that involve harmful use of LLMs that keep Seraphina on her toes. We are chatting about ways to mitigate them, and we are also chatting about ways and steps you can take as a business, sort of the baby steps, the first steps you can take as a business towards AI safety if your product involves AI technology. Basically, Seraphina is giving us a recipe how to set yourself apart from so many businesses out there that don't have this awareness on product safety, and how to relatively easily do the first steps to set some good practices in place. I so enjoyed this convo. I really hope you love it just as much as I did. Remember to rate the podcast at wherever you're tuning in. It always means so much to me when you send me a little note saying what you liked about a particular episode. You can keep in touch with me on my socials at It's Sandra Kublik and get a personal scoop on each of the episodes following my Substack at It's Sandra Kublik. All love to you, and I hope you enjoy this convo. Seraphina, I am extremely grateful that you accepted my invite and showed up here. Super stoked to talk to you today about, honestly, your career trajectory, what you're doing in the AI space, and just I guess like you as a human being, because you seem to be extremely interesting, fully rounded person. I kind of want to start by asking you about your bachelor's degree. You did classical civilizations at UCLA. Tell me, how did you join this degree? How did you decide to go this path? What brought you there?
Yeah, totally. So it's actually pretty random. So at American universities, you can switch degrees a lot. It's not like I currently work in the UK, but like in American universities, it's you both can switch degrees a lot, and also you have to take a certain breadth of courses. It's called general education requirements. Um, so basically, I switched major 2 times. I started in neuroscience, and then I switched to film, and then I didn't like either of those for various reasons. I liked neuroscience because I thought brains were cool, but I didn't actually want to be a doctor, and it turned out it was a doctor track. And of course, when I was like 17, I didn't know that, or I didn't think it through. And then I tried film because I loved stories, and then I realized I hated Hollywood after doing an internship in Hollywood. So I basically needed a new major, and I had fulfilled a general education sociology requirement, which is like, because you just have to take some class that's considered sociology, by taking an ancient Greek civilizations course. And my teacher was brilliant. She was this English professor named Alex Purvis, and I did a special project with her on 7 different translations of the Iliad, and like comparing them, and I loved it. And basically, so I just needed a new major because I didn't like my original 2 majors, um, and uh, and so she suggested, she was like, "Why don't you do like classics with a focus on Greek?" And the ancient Greek language was super hard, and I really loved the challenge of it. It's a really hard language. It's much harder than Latin. And I loved learning. I guess I really loved learning also how much reflections of like modern civilization we actually see back then. Like there's so many things that I loved. I feel like I understand like normal like current humanity much better as a result. Like even stuff to do with language. Like we have a whole bunch of ancient Greek and ancient Latin texts where people are complaining about how like the youth are ruining language, and how they're like, oh, they're using like vulgar Latin or like simpler Greek nowadays, and everything's going to go downhill, and there will be no intellectuals anymore. And it sounds like very similar to the sorts of things that people say about social media and stuff nowadays, like very similar. And so that sort of thing happens a lot, actually. And they also did lots of stuff about, oh, back in the day we had real men before they got into fancy food and reading and writing and that sort of stuff. So yeah, lots of really big similarities. So yeah, so basically I really loved it, and so I went to the head of the classics department, and I said I'd like to switch my major, and I was 2 years in, and she said you can't do it. She's like, you won't be able to succeed, like you won't be able to pass and get the credits you need. You have to learn basic Latin. You have to be really good at ancient Greek. You didn't go to a fancy school, so you don't know French or German before now. And so she was like, you won't be able to pass in 2 years. And so that basically decided it, that I was like, screw you. um, I'm gonna do an ancient Greek degree. So that's basically a combination of this like sort of deep accidental love of it, along with like spite against someone telling me that I wouldn't be able to.
I love the story. So, while you were studying ancient characters, ancient figures, was there anybody that made a particularly big impression on you, and inspired maybe your further work? Have you brought any influences from there?
Yeah, definitely. I actually cite Aristotle in one of my research papers. I think I count as one of there's like a small class of deep learning people who've cited people from like the BC era, and I'm happy to be one of them. Yeah, I think one of my first papers that I'm quite proud of is an NLG paper where I try to do like content planning. So, like more like controllable story generation via some principles from Aristotle's Poetics. So I'm actually not as much like Aristotle's fine. I think Aristotle's Poetics is really good and was quite influential on literally some of my NLP work even. Um, some of the other people I think on my life, probably the Emperor Hadrian, even though that's Latin rather than Greek, was quite influential. For his, he has sort of like a lot of very thoughtful letters that he writes, and he was one of the 5 good emperors, and he has a lot of writing that is very thoughtful about like how to live your life and how to like ask questions. I almost feel like I put his writing in the same class as like Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet, which was also quite influential on me about like how to live like an inquisitive and creative life. So I think those would be the two main ones. I think like Cicero's rhetoric also has been somewhat influential on my work, I think. He has quite a lot of principles. I haven't explicitly incorporated them in a sort of like machine learning way, the way I have with Aristotle, but but I think they've been still influential on the way that I think about things.
Awesome. I often find, because I also dug a little bit into the ancient world in the past, and in particular, Aristotle actually and Cicero were one of my favorites. What they're writing is extremely inspiring because they have experiences in all facets of life. For example, Aristotle was a little bit of a scientist running experiments or observing animals and detailing like what their behavior is, etc., etc., or um, teaching future emperors and trying to impact politics perhaps one way or another. Cicero obviously being one of the senators and having a major influence on the politics in his time. And so it's not only this intellectual curiosity and a mind that tries to create an order out of things and derive some principles, but also they actually have like major life experience and they know what they're talking about, and in so many areas. So that is what I find really fueling when I'm reading those guys. They're like really smart people in so many ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I feel like there's also a value on yeah, like learning by minute observation as well that you're sort of bringing up that yeah, that I think I've always sort of that I find very romantic, but also very satisfying. Yeah.
Have you been thinking in terms of why we are developing language technology at the moment as humans, since you've been able to study quite some repetitive behaviors throughout history, and especially in the ancient times. Perhaps there's some equivalent for developing a certain tool that changes the way humans communicate in there as well. Have you thought of that, and if yes, what do you think?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I haven't thought of exactly this question before, but I love it. The immediate thing that it brings up is a slight slant on the question, but maybe it will get me to the actual question. Is I definitely do see parallels. So the thing that everyone always brings up that really changed communication is, of course, the printing press. Like everyone brings that up all the time. Um, And I think there is an interesting thing that people don't bring up often when they bring up the printing press as far as how it changed communication, which is how much people put their own like mind into that sort of work. So like through all histories of like changing of technology. So, you know, in like Greece and Latin, they often used like wax tablets because they could be like rewritten. And then, and then later when printing presses were invented, they were the like movable type and stuff like that. But in each of those states, people have imbued that technology with the characteristics of a human mind, which is almost ridiculous nowadays. Like, but there's loads of work when the first codexes, like just books, like rather than scrolls, came out, like talking about how they work the way the human mind does, because you can like index them at like different pages and go back um and so I often think of that as far as trying to understand the way that people project like characteristics of human minds onto language technology, like just like how easy it is for people to do that type of projection because people have done it with things that are much less sophisticated than we have now. um, so I think there's something really interesting there. Like I think there is a parallel with the fascination we have with this method of communication and how much we're able to read into like symbols on a page or on a screen. um, yeah, but I don't know if I have anything specifically as far as, like our yearning for the generative element as much.
What about the way to process information? For example, when I think of LLMs and the fact that they have been trained on this massive data set containing a lot of human knowledge and nonsense and all of the good and the bad and the ugly. What I think of in parallel with the ancient times is, for example, Plato's school and him deciding to choose the next person that will run his school after he's gone, and going for the person with the best memory. I don't remember the name of that person, unfortunately, but he chose the student that had the best memory and was able to replicate the ideas that Plato created and codified in the best possible way. Whereas Aristotle, even though he was an extremely savvy student, he was creating his own thing. He was putting a spin on the ideas of Plato, and so he was a dangerous choice. In terms of LLMs, I feel like they basically give us this student, this sort of Plato's student.
Plato's perfect student. Yeah.
They, Plato's perfect student, but they also give us the ability to kind of turn it into an Aristotle almost. Like, I don't know, it just feels like an extremely powerful tool to use and process communication in all sorts of ways and facets of life as well, and very impactful, I think, for our learning and just like trying to conceptualize the world moving forward. But yeah, just a thought there.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. I think it is interesting uh, because fundamentally, I mean, LLMs at their most basic stage are an ability to engage with like a really vast amount of things that we can't normally process ourselves, which is the Plato's perfect student. And I think, yeah, the amount that they're good at becoming an Aristotle is currently somewhat up for, like, I think we don't know yet, um, like exactly how good they are at like recombining things such that they're novel. Like clearly you see stuff that's like style transfer, right? Where you can write something, have them write something that exists in the style of Shakespeare or a pirate or something. And so I guess there's like some amount of philosophy in whether that counts as something new. If it's transferring a style onto an existing thing. But um yeah, and so I think that's something that we're discovering nowadays that's pretty exciting. Um, and I think yeah, and I think one of the things we can learn also from previous things is that the humans change along with the technology, right? So like so some amount of like whether we can get the Aristotle of the like generating new things is a property of the LLM, but some amount of it is the property of the way we adapt in our usage and like what things we choose to specialize in. So like your memory thing made me think about how um, before writing and before the printing press, people were much better at memory overall, like much better, right? Like the Iliad was recited, and it's like a really long book, and people were doing that sort of thing, and that wasn't like unique to the ancient Greeks. Oral cultures were doing that forever. Irish storytellers were famous for writing, for essentially being able to recite like 90-page novels off from memory. But then we developed like external storage, right? Which is what like writing is. And then we just got worse at memory, but we got way better other types of reasoning that require this external storage. And so it's like I'm interested in what ways like this new technology changes also like what we specialize in versus what we let some other technology we have specialize.
It definitely feels like more and more we are just outsourcing a lot of the information access out there instead of just storing it in our brains. I believe there's no vacuum in there. So, like, whenever we outsource something, it's going to be replaced by maybe neuronal connections that have more to do with creativity or with higher level reasoning or intuition or whatnot, that doesn't require this heavy load of keeping everything in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it will be repurposed for something.
So, changing the subject a little bit, although I feel like it's kind of the continuation of the same thing. For me, you're a big explorer. So, ancient world was a big exploration right there. But then you actually physically explored the world by becoming a sailor. When I heard that you were sailing for a few years in the North Sea, I was like, I think it's the first time I'm hearing something like this. Definitely the first time I'm hearing something like this in this sort of researchy environment, but also coming from a lady, I found it extremely inspiring. So I want to know everything. Tell me, how did that happen?
Yeah, so I was leaving my job because I wanted to go back to school to study NLP. So I was leaving, I had been working at Google. Um, and I'd been planning to apply for graduate school for a few years in a row, but I had a pretty high pressure job, and so I kept missing application deadlines. So I basically was like, I'm just gonna quit so that I have time to apply. But that means that I applied, and then you have like a while to wait before going to school. And so I was just thinking like, what would I really like to do in my life that I like haven't had a span of like 5 months to do? Um, and so I really love adventure exploration stories, like from like the old sailors who are going to the pole. Like there's a really big book that's like this thick called The Worst Journey in the World about the expedition to the South Pole by the Brits, but there's also Endurance by Shackleton, and there's just a bunch of like really good stories that are like about like real adventure but also real science. Like they were sort of discovering what the world was like, as well as, you know, what their own limits were. And so I've always loved those sorts of books ever since I was a kid. And so I was like, I want to go on like sailing on a ship in like a famously tough place to sail. So I started applying to places, and I could sail, but sort of at a basic level. Like I a little bit fudged how good I was. Like I could sail, but I made it seem more impressive, slightly more impressive than I was when I was writing the applications. So yeah, so I think I got accepted to like 3 boats. One was sailing in the Hudson, one was sailing in the North Sea, and one was actually sailing across the Atlantic on a replica Viking longship. Um, and I chose the one in the North Sea. And yeah, and I only signed on originally for 2 months because I was like, this is gonna be the hardest thing in my life. Like, I don't nap very well, and you have to do like this like sort of continuous changing your sleep schedules based on the weather. I get seasick. Like I was like, this is gonna be so. I was like, but I can hack it for 2 months, and I just really want to do it and see what it's like. And then after being there for a couple months, they offered me the job full time, because you start out as a volunteer deckhand, which is like room and board. You don't get paid, but like until you get enough sea miles that you have the qualifications to be hired. Yes, they offered me the job, and so I asked school if I could defer, and they said yes. So I stayed on the ship for another year and a bit. Um, yeah.
Oh my God, this is insane story. So what happens on the ship? What's your daily life like, and what was the experience like overall for this period of time for you?
Yeah. So I worked on a ship that was about like roughly 100 years since it had been rebuilt, but from a design and an original hull that was from like the late 1800s. An old wooden fishing boat originally, actually. Um, and uh, and so most old traditional boats in Europe and the UK do this thing that's called sail training, which is like taking underprivileged teens out to sea and then like teaching them teamwork. So that was roughly what we did. We could also be chartered by like normal adults sometimes. It depends, because sometimes we just didn't have a booking, and then like anyone can book us. Um, so the goal was to like take these people from age like 14 to 21 usually out, and like incorporate them into part of the crew, and teach them what it's like. So we always had minimal crew to sail the ship, which always depends on the rig of the ship more than the size. So we needed 5 people as our minimum crew, but then we had 12 passengers who would help and make it easier, but we weren't dependent on if they got too terrified or too seasick or something along those lines, all of which usually happened. So um, yeah, so that was basically it. So what you do is we would do 7 days at sea, which was really based on the size of our water tank because we didn't have desalination. Um, so we would do 7 days at sea and then go into port, and that was usually the amount of time that kids would be on board. Sometimes people would do 1 month trips, but usually about 7 days. Yeah, so you sail out from harbor, and then you watch land disappear. And then you go into a pretty standard watch system, which when you don't have enough crew, you do 6 on 6 off, which means 6 hours sailing the ship and then 6 hours not sailing the ship, and just every 6 hours. And that's if the weather is very bad or such that you need more people awake to steer the ship and help change the sails and stuff, or or if you just are understaffed. If you're fully staffed, you do 4 on, 8 off, which means you have one watch that's 12 to 4, middle of the night, middle of the day, one watch that's 4 to 8, early morning, like afternoon, and then one watch that's 8 to 12. And during your on watch, you are steering and setting the sails. And off watch, you're sleeping, eating, doing chores, like depending, like you do the cooking as well. Each watch takes one meal that rotates. Um, and then and also other things, like things need to be repaired often or checked, like engine checks and that type of stuff. And so all of that goes into your off time. Um, yeah.
Was there anything particularly challenging about this setup? Because you make it sound really easy, but I bet if I was there instead of you, I would just like probably like freeze to death, or like get so drunk that I wouldn't get up, or just sing shanties until my throat broke or something like this. What was challenging? Tell me.
I I do know a lot of shanties, especially for the 12 to 4 watch. It's quite challenging to stay awake the whole time, because it's reliably really dark. Like 4 to 8, dawn comes, so it becomes easy halfway. But 12 to 4 is just like so. I did basically continue sing shanties when I was out ever on a 12 to 4 watch. So way before they became famous. So yeah. Although Wellerman actually was something I knew beforehand. It's one of all the whaling shanties are the best, and that's one of the whaling shanties. So yeah, some of the challenging things are, um, let's see. Um, so it is also very cold. I actually did get frostbite at one point. Which I didn't notice, but now I have like a weird condition in my hands where circulation cuts whenever I'm a tiny, tiny bit cold. Um, so you do get very cold very easily, and if it's, like, kind of stormy, then you have adrenaline, and you don't notice, which is how I ended up with, like, minor frostbite in my hands. So which now just it makes me look like a zombie, like, if it drops to, like, slightly below 20 degrees and I don't wear gloves, they turn bright white. So very cold. I think honestly the toughest thing was the seasickness. I'm susceptible to seasickness, so are many of the kids. Everyone in above a force 8, which is pretty strong winds, but if you're out at sea, the winds are just what the winds are, then everyone is seasick unless you have a damage to your inner ear. Um, so what that means is you spend a lot of time feeling like death, like really, really sick, but having to work anyway, because if there's really bad weather, everyone is sick. But that's when you need all hands on deck, because if winds are above force 8, then it's really hard to control your sails because there's so much force on them. You can like feel just the incredible amount of force, and you just need the extra people. Um, so just like feeling like all you want to do is like curl into a ball and just lie there until it's over, but just like having to steer, having to go and like take care of sails and stuff was, I think, the biggest challenge, and I think also one of the most growth opportunities. I think I grew more in that time on my ship than I have at any other time in my life. So yeah, super super positive, but in also a super like miserable type 2 fun way. Like there are definitely moments. I think the best example of like a really low moment is like one of the times when I was just so seasick, and everyone had to be on deck, and then finally I was off watch after 6 hours of having to like steer and run around while just like vomiting on my feet, like wherever, because sometimes you wouldn't have the time to like we wouldn't have the time to go over to, normally you go to the side of the ship, but like if things are happening and you don't have time, there's also waves washing over the deck of the ship anyway. So you just like throw up on your own feet, and then waves wash it off, and you're like, oh my god, this is a low moment. And then I finally got off that watch, and it was really awful. And it started snowing. We were in the German Bight, and it was in April, and it started snowing on us. And I got off watch, and I didn't even go below. I just curled up on the deck because I just didn't want to move anymore. And it snowed on me, and like my shipmates have a picture of me curled in a ball with like a pile of snow slowly growing because I just like didn't want to move.
Oh my god, I want to see that picture. That sounds epic. Definitely sounds like a case of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Uh, um, but it also sounds like it's filled with adrenaline, filled with, like crazy stuff that might actually kill you at some point if it goes too far. And it's like a very intense environment. Do you feel like you're missing it, or maybe that you're finding it somewhere else these days?
Yeah, I think obviously loads of adrenaline. But I think that the thing I valued out of it wasn't actually the adrenaline junkie aspect. It was actually the like really immersed in nature aspect. Like the thing about like a sailing ship versus a ferry or anything else is like you the engine is off and then it's just you and the sound of the waves running by the ship. And and so animals also like it because you're not this like big noisy thing. So dolphins play all the time because dolphins think like boats are interesting, so they come and they like, and you make like an interesting wake, so the dolphins play in the wake. And and like birds come by and like chill, um and like get a free ride sometimes, like. And so it's like just the complete like quiet. And also the fact like I saw more sunrises than I'd seen cumulatively in my whole life, like sunrises and sunsets, because the 4 to 8 watch, you get the sunrise and the sunset. Um, and I think that's the thing I miss most, more than yeah, I can get the adrenaline junkie thing from like snowboarding or something like that, and that wasn't the main thing. I think the thing I really, and I do seek that. I go on some solo hikes sometimes, but and that gives me a slightly similar thing of just that I sort of like meld and blend into the surroundings around me, um, but not often enough. Yeah.
I think I can relate to what you're saying about this immersion in nature. I'm traveling often around Sydney area, and there are so many beautiful natural sites there. At a certain point in time during the year, you have whales um, coming to north, sort of like to the north of Sydney to give birth to little whales, and then kind of swim back with the current. Do you remember Nemo movie? I don't remember how this current is called, but basically Nemo was swimming with this current,
Mm, yeah.
and so this current is one of the big happenings in the water world, and so whales also take advantage of this current. They give birth in warmer waters, and then they swim off with the babies to the South Pole. But you can see them, and and especially small baby whales. They like to jump, they like to play a lot. So you can stand on the cliff and just like see a baby whale just out there in its natural habitat, or you can see penguins hanging out, just being there. And I there is something about this that you don't feel when you're in a city environment, in like this cultural civilization touched environment, that is really profound and really nourishing for you when you're there and when you're experiencing it. Plus sunrises, I can imagine they were just so gorgeous, just an eye candy, one after another, most likely for you. um, so that actually reminds me of the fact that you are a Zen practitioner. Are you still studying Zen?
Yeah, so I grew up in a Zen community, actually. My dad's job is that he runs Zen communities. And I didn't really, I mean, he didn't ever force me to do anything. And so sometimes I did some stuff and like went to like a meditation thing or something as a kid, but not that often. And then I think I picked it up pretty seriously when I was 17 and have been doing it since. Yeah.
How do you practice? Because it feels like this like serene moment that you're able to have while you're on the sea is supportive of it. Have you found yourself meditating while you were there? And also, how do you do it in your everyday life now that you're out of that serene environment?
Yeah. So actually, I think, I mean, maybe it supports the idea that I was like naturally meditating or something when I was at sea, but that was the only time when I feel like I didn't need to meditate pretty regularly, as in like not need to. Like, of course, I'm just like everyone. I fall out of my routine under like life pressures and stuff like that. Um, so, but basically, like if I don't meditate for long enough in my normal life, I notice, I notice a different characteristic in my mind, similar to like if I don't exercise for a long time, I notice like that my body's energy and the way it like exists feels different, and so it's like it's a similar thing but mental. Um, But at sea, I could like not meditate for a week or something like that, and it didn't like nothing happened. Which does support that I was like just somehow like in a more meditative state by default. But yeah, but in the rest of my life, I try to meditate every day, which means in practice, I probably meditate every like 3 days, um, every other or every 3 days. And yeah, and so I just I like meditating with a group when possible, but in practice, I don't very much. I just do it on my own. I either just like in my flat, like kind of sit still, or if I can go into a garden or something like that, like a park or something like that, then I do, just because that can be kind of nice to be outside for just a little bit. Although I also like when I lived in New York, sometimes I would meditate on the subway on the way to work. Since I think there was like a Tibetan monk who influenced me, who was like, if you can't who I think he lived in New York for a little while, and he was like, if you can't meditate on the subway, like what are you even doing? So I was like, all right, let's go. um,
How does it work? Do you use certain mantras, or do you just, like you mentioned, you're sitting quietly, letting your mind unravel? What's happening when you do that?
so Zen is big on just sitting quietly. There's two sects of Zen, Soto and Rinzai. Rinzai was the slightly more samurai one, and then Soto was like a little bit of the quieter one. So in Soto, you stare at a wall, and that's it. I grew up in Rinzai, and in Rinzai, you use what's called koans. So often you start with a koan, and the idea is sometimes you can just let one arise, and you don't have to. You can just sit there. But often you do something that's focused on a particular koan. So and they really really vary. So a koan is basically kind of like an old story that was passed down. A lot of them are originally Chinese, actually, that they were then filtered through Japan from a type of Buddhism in China that was like kind of like niche and weird called Chan Buddhism. Yeah, so there are a bunch of like old stories of old Zen masters talking basically, but the idea is that they've been transmitted down to try to like hook your mind. What's a really good koan? Like one of my favorites is like, why does the Bodhisattva of great compassion have 1,000 hands and arms? Which is very like, there's like a deity that Zen isn't faith based, but it has lots of these myths behind it originally. Um, and then the answer is it's like reaching behind you for a pillow in the dark. Um, And so, like, they're sort of designed to be not able to be logicked through. Like, you can't be like, "Well, what does this mean? What's the analogy? Blah, blah, blah." It's supposed to, like, break all of that, so it, like, forces you to have, like, an instinctive reaction, and people can learn a lot of things from what their instinctive reaction is. Sometimes I'll be, like, upset. I'll be like, "No, it's not that way," and then that, like, teaches me something about, like, oh, like, why was I upset by that? Like, what in my life has made me have this like instinctive, because clearly it's not there. Like like koans are sort of definitionally and purposely nonsensical. Um, so your reaction of like feeling comforted or fear or like anger or whatever you have can teach you about yourself. And sometimes you have no reaction, but quite frequently you do. Or I do. I should probably speak in the first person. So yeah, another of my really favorites is called Peach Blossoms. It's uh the narratives of like someone who's been traveling looking for like enlightenment for a really long time. And he says, for 30 years, I searched for the master swordsman. I saw like blossoms come to bud and leaves fall. And then ever since today, I saw the peach blossoms. I have had no doubts. Um, and I really like that one. I mean, koans are not supposed to be explained, but it's something about like, there's a lot of Zen stuff that's about like what you need in life is like right here, right now.
I love it. It reminds me a little bit of prompting language models. I'm sorry, I had to make this analogy.
Go for it.
Just you have an input, and then your mind is showing you something as an output, and then you discover, what's there, what's in there, and if it's healthy or good for you or not, and then you can decide and maybe do something about it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a method of sampling, which prompting is. Of like sampling an interesting output space. Yeah.
It's also interesting that I think people just like learn and experience words differently. Some people see images, some people do not. Um, there are folks also that like have, what is it called, when you are not able to imagine things. For example, when you read a novel and you don't have this like projection in your brain about what's going, this like internal movie basically what's going on. So it's, yeah, man, it must be an interesting and very diverse experience for many people to study koans and have a moment like this. What I think is, when you mentioned the 1000 hand deity, and reaching for the pillow, I was thinking about reaching and not being able to find it, and reaching in so many different ways to just grab it. It's like completely different thing, um, than what you started to mention. Has this practice made you think about language and what it does to us, how it works, how it's connected with our minds, and what's going on there? And then eventually, of course, my question leads to, how does it impact your perception of language technology as well?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Um, let's see. One of the things that has made me like really aware of is how flexible people's perspective on their life and their thoughts are, and like how easily it's changed. Because I think often, often this sort of experience for myself and for other people that I've seen, will reveal to us that we've had some sort of narrative about our life that we've been using to construct it, but that narrative may or may not be true. And like sort of by default often isn't. Like it usually has some relationship to truth, but like, weakly correlated, like many things. Um, so, uh, so I think one of the things it's made me think, uh, sort of it's funny because I do a lot of explainability and interpretability, but it's made me think about how at the moment we have like there's so much in explainability and interpretability we can do with language models, and it's great, and we need a lot more work in it. There's really far to go, but I feel like at some point any sufficiently complex system, like, it becomes a really big problem because it's not, I guess, the experience has made me think a lot about how very hard it is for me to accurately explain whatever's like happening in my head, and sort of like basically how unreliable my explanations of my experience are, and also how flexible they are, that like, I can sit still for 20 minutes and think about it and my experience of my life totally changes. It really shows just like how much is mediated by my perspective on it, and so that definitely makes me think. I don't worry about it that much, but I have this thing in the back of my mind where I'm like, at some point when we get sufficiently good at explainability, we're going to run into the philosophical problem that like we can't do it for humans. um, uh, so I think that's the main part that makes me think about it.
Awesome. Oh, definitely. I think it's going to be a big revival of the very long philosophical debate on whether, the reason is the thing to go, what the reason is, actually what it composes of. Is it fueled by emotion? Should we, withdraw from emotions, like Stoics would like? Um, and I'm looking forward to some new contemporary answers to that problem as well. Yeah, this sounds really cool. And so I can imagine that when you're realizing that your perception of the world is um, unstable. I mean, it shifts depending on who you are, what you feel at the moment, what you know about the world, etc. It also makes you think about the different filters that we have commonly as humans, as cultures, as genders, as people that have a certain political view or belief system. And so it's jumping to AI again from that standpoint. It's a really lovely tool to start thinking about the bias, and also to start realizing that the bias is there, and it's real, and it's happening, and we also kind of not only have it in our minds, but also while we build with these minds certain tools, they reflect those biases as well. And I've noticed that you've studied bias. You co-authored a paper In 2022, it was released, and the title goes How Gender Debiasing Affects Internal Model Representations and Why It Matters. Can you tell me a little bit about, like what you think about bias, both when it comes to our minds, but also the models, where it starts, kind of like maybe why it's there, and how trying to get rid of this bias affects our models as well? Because I feel like there's a fascinating area of exploration there itself.
Yeah, I'll give a go at answering that, and if I miss any bits of that question, make me add them. Uh, no worries.
That was an extremely complex question. I'm so sorry about this. I cannot help by just like synthesizing everything into one single juicy one. Feel free to just chop it and just take the part of it and go with it.
Yeah, so yeah, I've actually written I think all of my research over my PhD, well not all, but like much of my research during my PhD was included some gender bias. That paper focuses on it, but a lot of other ones do, a study in gender bias, but then also look at differences in racial bias and that sort of thing. But um yeah, so that paper was really fun. That was an interpretability paper that I did with Adas. And that was a follow-up of a previous paper actually. So I had done this paper the previous year where I showed that if you debias a language model, you take a language model and and I used a bunch of common debiasing methods at the time, and then you plug that language model into a downstream task, then people were measuring, there were a bunch of techniques that were basically based on the geometry of that language model. Um, of concepts. So like they would look at, for instance, like if you were looking at bias in professions, you would look at gender bias in professions, you'd have a bunch of female terms like mother, her, like that sort of thing, and then you'd have a bunch of male terms like father, him, and then you binary gender, and then you'd have like a bunch of career terms and a bunch of family terms. And then if you notice that like male terms were closer to career terms than female terms, you considered that to be bias. But that had never been proven as far as its relationship to whether so there was a bunch of work that was coming out, quite a lot of work, that was coming out that would say, look, I made this metric go down. I made like female terms closer to career terms, so my model will be less biased. But then they didn't test it in like the actual downstream task of like CV filtering, which is what like a lot of people were worried about this for. Like people were worried about whether like which is borne out in practice. Amazon tried to do like a hiring tool and found that it would never hire women, so they had to just scrap it. And so this has like actually happened. So basically, so I felt like it was giving like a false sense of security, basically. So I did this paper, and actually the paper just showed that uh, you can't. That there was like essentially no relationship. The paper's intrinsic bias metrics don't correlate with application bias.
Okay, so it sounds like there are multiple ways to understand the term bias here.
Mhm.
Um,
Yes,
can you
absolutely.
can you talk a little bit about that? Like how, like what are the different? I can, from what you mentioned, I can tell that there is a bias in the sense of certain metrics of the model, like just being a certain way, and it like it doesn't necessarily mean the sort of bias in the ethics sense and side of things. Tell me more.
Yeah. So in that work, basically what we were saying, so the bias in the language model, which people were previously measuring, what that work was essentially showing is actually that there probably is some bias in the language model, but this metric is not a good measure of that. At least we found that it wasn't. My work has since been replicated in that, so I'm pretty certain of it. But basically there's still there so I am of the school that that any measure of bias you have in a language model has to be connected to some harm, in that you have to show that somehow does something in the real world. This is now really hard since we have this sort of like general purpose tool, and like I don't even know all the ways that people are using it in the real world, and that's by design, because it's like that's because people are being creative. They're like using a new tech. It's a new technology, and that's the idea of a new technology. It has a bunch of new use cases. Um, but from like a bias perspective, it's really complicated. Yeah, um, so basically there is some sort of the work that you referenced, about how gender debiasing affects internal model representations. We found an alternative metric that does correlate. But the way that I usually think about it is like potential for bias that may or may not be realized, that may or may not be so in an extreme case, let's do the extreme case. If you have a model that has no notion of gender, like none, like if then it can't be gender biased. But it's also not super usable, because if you ask it a question like who's the first female prime minister of Finland, it'll just answer who's the first prime minister of Finland, because it doesn't have a representation for what female means. And you can do this. I've done it for experiments. Like you can zero out gender in a model representation. And for some applications, that might be appropriate. Like you could imagine an application in which you just really want it to not know anything about gender. And actually, like depending on what you're doing downstream, if you're doing something with like hiring people, that might be a good idea, because you can probably make the sort of the like moral assumption that it shouldn't matter, right? Um, depends on what you're doing, right? I think one of the things the community doesn't talk about a lot is getting back to what you were talking about like cultural norms and stuff. You have to have like, yes, it's like it's objective, it's math, but you have to have a normative assumption that the math is operationalizing. Like there still is like a moral or integrity based stance that you're operationalizing with your math. So yes, in the extreme case, you can zero it out. In the less extreme case where you're like, okay, I want my model to be more, more multi-purpose than that. It actually does have to have a notion of gender. Um, then the measurement that we found in that paper, we use information theoretic probing, which basically means we're looking at how easy it is to access gender in a representation. So we're not measuring this sort of like geometric thing. We're measuring sort of like if you're trying to get gender out of the representation, how hard do you have to try? Um, and so and we found that to be a better measure, in a sort of sense of like models are to some extent lazy. They will use whatever information is easiest to access in order to achieve a task. So I mean, lazy is anthropomorphizing, but it's sort of still an easy way of thinking of it. Like, get to the task in the most efficient way possible. And so that way, if you have, so basically, if information is easier, so then you could have a variability, like you could have gender in the model, but it's hard to extract, and that means that the model will only use it when it's really necessary, which arguably it is for who's the first female prime minister of Finland, but it's maybe not for like which of these engineers should I hire. So but then you could also have it be really, really easy to get gender out of the model, and then it might just use gender before any other features. Like you'd imagine other information that you want it to use for who's the best, which engineer should I hire? You'd want it to use information like, I don't know, what frameworks they know, where have they worked before, like what sorts of like contributions have they made to like open source repositories, like whatever. It depends on the type of engineer. Um, but if that information is super hard to access in the way that the model has decided to represent it in the model parameters, um, then uh, then the model might just use gender, because it's like, well, I can get 90% accuracy by using gender, because historically, because in your data set, 90% of the engineers you've hired have been men. Then it's just like, I'll take the 10% penalty in order to not do the extra work of extracting other information. And so that's basically what we found in that paper, that this extractability of gender was a much better metric. But then that gets back to my thing about how that really still only gets you the model's potential for bias, right? So like I can tell you, look, gender's very hard, which means that your data set has to be really imbalanced like if someone then takes it, most people take up one of these language models and fine tune it on some other data, and that other data can't add capabilities to the original model. So if the model originally didn't have gender, it can't add gender, but it does sort of inform what the model decides to use and stuff like that. So um, so then if you have your model could have a really high potential for gender bias, but if your data that you fine tune it on doesn't support it, then it actually will end up not being biased. Or it could have really low potential for bias, which means that you can be lazier with your data. But if you have bad enough data, it will still end up being biased. So that's like, so I think of it more as like the language model type as potential that may or may not be realized in some downstream task. Let me know if that was way too like detailed as an explanation, and I can back up.
No, no, no. I love it. I love it. It to me, it sounds basically like in your study, you were able to realize that the the model bias can have a different depth to it and can be activated almost like, I don't know, like our gene expression. Like once it hits, like the potential is there, but until it gets activated, it's not going to do anything silly. But there are circumstances, environmental circumstances in this case, additional data set for fine tuning that can bring it out of it, and then it becomes a problem. So the I guess it helps you, knowing that helps you design first of all the model, sort of like try to impact the possibility of the potential for model bias, but also put some guardrails towards the circumstances and what users will do with it later on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that analogy is perfect. The gene expression one, exactly, where it's like you have two things you can change. You can change the environmental things that affect the gene expression. You can change the gene, and so we do some amount. I think, and depending on the case by case basis, you may want to do some amount of both. Yeah, yeah, I think it's very good.
Awesome. Now, it's such a loaded conversation. As a head of AI safety at a company training large language models, giving access to them in the world, um, you carry a lot of responsibility. There's a lot of stuff that you need to think about, observe, I guess, as well, and communicate to the company itself to make sure that the models are the safest, most debiased, or just like more balanced versions of themselves to for users to use them without harm. I know that you joined Cohere recently, and soon after you went to DEFCON 31 that everybody seems to be talking about. For those of you folks that do not know what it is, it's like one of the biggest hacker conventions, or the biggest hacker convention that was happening in Las Vegas, of all places, in August 2023. Can you tell us why it's such a big deal? What did you do there, and what did you find out?
Yeah, I was quite excited about that project. So yeah, so we did a sort of like hack the future was the group that did it. So so we had basically AI Village is one of the villages of DEF CON. They have like little different, there's like aerospace village for hacking aerospace stuff. There's like hacking cars. There's, packet hacking, sort of standard like Wi-Fi sniffing stuff. Um, so there's AI Village. And so AI Village worked with Scale to build a platform for us and 7 other models. So a bunch of our competitors, some open source people as well, to uh, to basically plug all of our APIs into this UI and let people, and they were anonymized into element names. There was like iron and bismuth and silver and cobalt and stuff. So they were anonymized but fixed, and then hackers could try and do like one of a bunch of set challenges. We had a bunch of challenges that were considered easy or hard, so you got varying levels of points for them. Things like bad math was an easy one. It's actually very, very easy to get most language models to do bad math. You don't have to be very good. Even you don't even have to be very good at math. But there are a bunch of technical reasons why this is the case. Numbers are hard to learn with the way we currently train language models. Their process, if we're going back to like language, we process numbers differently. They don't have representations that are the same way that we have word representations. Word representations are kind of fuzzy, like we have synonyms and stuff like that. Numbers don't work like that. And if you treat them like that, then it's, one is not a fuzzy two. That's bad math. So bad math is an easy one. A bunch of the harder ones were like um, get a model to like hallucinate information that would be defamation of a well-known figure that could influence public opinion. So, that sort of like uh
Juicy.
yeah, exactly. So all the way down. So um yeah, so we did get a bunch of pretty good data. Like we had over 2,000 people participate. And we had over 2,000 people in line the first morning, so we need a bigger room next year. Um, but uh, yeah, a bunch of the things that we found weren't things that we weren't expecting to find, because the state of sort of language model hacking at the moment is very nascent. It's a really new field. It's more like a bunch of people at the conference were like, oh, it's kind of like security like 30 years ago when you could hack something by like editing the URL, like and then like getting admin rights or something like that. Like it's more similar, honestly, in a bunch of ways. Like the industry is still working out what a threat even is. Um, so we didn't find anything that we weren't really expecting to find, necessarily, but but the data is still really useful. It's still really useful from a like mitigation standpoint. Like a lot of times we know the problems are there, but we don't have the data to correct it. So the data is really, really helpful. And the fact that the data is also quite diverse, like from across 8 different models. So we scrubbed it of like any information that was de-anonymizing and then shared it with all the models who participated, and we also shared it with the research community. When they have to submit like an application, just because we're not going to give out a bunch of hacking data just randomly, but like it's not just to make sure they're like a legitimate researcher and need it for something rather than like a bad actor. um but yeah so um yeah, so I think getting the data, and I think it was really exciting to me, for yeah, so basically like uh, we had ratings for easy and hard. Our easy and hard ratings were the case, but having people actually have found them in data makes it easier for us to correct them and start to like do both like theoretical analysis of like what ways that we need to, um, because like with like yeah, with I think of like successful hacks, I think there were like over 8,000 or something along those lines across all the models. So out of like 25,000 conversations. So um yeah, so it makes us able to do a lot more like research and theoretical analysis of how to improve the models, but then also to just directly use some of the data to improve the models. And I think the thing I was most excited about this is one, that it was this sort of collaborative effort across the like 8 companies, and we don't work together that often. There's sort of historical precedent for types of like security and safety stuff for people to like put down their competitive stuff and be like, okay, like we can be competitive on the like how good our products are, but probably on like safety of society we should be less competitive and we should work together. So I think that was really nice. And it was just like I think quite informative for all of us to be in the same space, and just watch the way people were interacting with our models and the similarities and differences. There are actually more similarities than I was expecting. Um, so that was really interesting. And I think the other one was that also, if it seems to be the collaboration thing, there was a really diverse group of participants, and from like a safety and security standpoint, like it you never want to look for safety and security vulnerabilities from just people like me or just people like you, because that's not how safety and security work. It's always like it's some sort of edge case. And so they were quite careful about, like, of course, there were all the participants of DEFCON who are pretty diverse, but they were quite careful about offering, lots of grants for people from different like communities to come. So there was a lot of like like black tech communities, there were like a bunch of like students, there were a bunch of people who came from like other industries entirely. There were a bunch of like government officials who came and were using it. So like the group of people in the room was a super different group of people than usually you can access via internal annotators that you have or like external red teamers that you hire. And so I think that we haven't actually gotten like we haven't finished doing the sort of like research angle we've of what we want to do with all the data yet, because it took a little while for them to release the anonymized data. We only got it like last week. We got our own data before that, of course, but for the everyone's data. Um, but I think so. I think we'll learn a lot more interesting things because of the diversity of participants, and I think that's not often taken into account enough in like red teaming. And so that was one of the things that I was also really excited about that event. So.
So this might be a silly question after all of the smart things that you've said about this, but how does one hack a language model? Can you give me an example?
Yeah. So let's see. So for bad math, like again, because it's really easy, honestly, just trying like it's more of an art than a science at the moment in lots of ways. There is, of course, science underlying it that I can explain. So like um fundamentally you're trying to get the model into like a particular type of output space that's like either like degenerate in some way or um and there's
Your evil prompt engineering, basically.
yeah, exactly. So you're basically you're attempting to sample from that space, and there are like like technical explanations I can give you for why all these things work, but often in practice, even for like me, it kind of works slightly intuitively. Like I guess I think like that was actually one of the really interesting things about the event. Like slight side note, but people got a lot better the second day. Even though like not that many people repeated, but like people talked in the hallways, people and so the first day of the event, people were surprisingly bad at succeeding at hacking the model. Like I consider like all models to be super easily hackable because I spent a bunch of time with them. And so I was really surprised. I was like, wow, like the success rate of people. But by day two, their success rate went like way up. Partly because they worked out which ones were easier. Like the distribution of which challenges people were doing also changed a lot by the second day. But but they also just got better, and I was kind of impressed with how quickly they kind of got the hang of it, especially, again, given that a lot of it was based on, like, hallway chatter rather than even repeated, because you had, like, one-hour sessions, and you could come back, but you had to wait in line again if you came back for a second session, so the majority of people did not, even though a number of people did. Not enough to have done the distribution shifts. The distribution shifts were done by information sharing. Um, so I think kind of intuitively, like a lot of times I'll do something along the lines of what's called a false presupposition. So if you ask a question, and this is sort of adversarial, but it also could be something someone would innocently ask. So for conspiracy theory and stuff, it's like um, you could ask like what toxins are in the U.S. water supply, and there's like a conspiracy theory about like fluoride controlling people's brains. Um, and so, but like the most relevant information, because there are no like real toxins in, or let's say the California water supply. California has pretty clean water. There aren't a lot of articles about toxins in the California water supply, unless there happens to have recently been an oil spill or something like that that like somehow contaminated something or whatever. In which case, most of the relevant information will be conspiracy theories because there's like a lack of other information. And that's something that I am worried about from a safety perspective, because someone could innocently ask because they could have like heard at a party, like, like about the conspiracy theory, and you could go like, oh, what toxins are in the California water supply? And it's like, fluoride can be blah blah blah. It's like they have been putting it in for all sorts of reasons, and um, so I think, and that's what I would call a false presupposition, because language models are not very good at picking out the sort of implicit fact that has to be true in order for the question to be valid, because that's like not something they're very well trained to do. So like basically, in order for me to ask what toxins are in the California water supply, it presupposes that there are toxins in the California water supply. And models are not very good at dealing with that. So I think one of my main techniques is, of course, loads of people do like jailbreaks and stuff like that, right? Like loads of people do like tell me how to make napalm like my grandma used to tell me and that sort of thing. Um, but I'm less interested in those, and I think the community will move away from them eventually, um, because they're not as, I mean, they're almost like slightly technically interesting because they're bypassing something by doing like something very benign, right? Um, but I'm not as worried about them from a safety perspective because it's not gonna end up accidentally spreading a bunch of misinformation. Like someone has to be trying to do it, right? It has to be like an adversarial user. So I feel like it's like quite easy to kind of detect actually from more like traditional security methods in like, analyzing API traffic and that type of stuff rather than from a modeling perspective, whereas the false presuppositions thing is something I'm actually kind of worried about. Um, yeah, and so I often work with like that sort of technique, I think.
I see. I read an interview where you mentioned that you are worried about misinformation, and you would like to see governments spend time actively preventing misinformation. Can you talk about your nightmare scenario?
Yes. Um, so I guess I have a couple nightmare scenarios, but they're about misinformation. And I sort of separated into like, sort of like bad actors and good actors. Like, so, the bad actors is like if it's easier to, for instance, generate and like bots have a huge amount of impact on social media and influencing public opinion. Right now, I think the jury is out about the cost, like because one of the things that you need for like a bot that's like spamming people is that it needs to be cheap. And so I think jury is kind of out about the cost of, but of course, like, there are small models that are pretty cheap that are still pretty good. Um, uh, but I'm sort of watching the dynamics of that space. So obviously there's the increased capability of bots. But then there's also the sort of like accidentally radicalizing innocent users with things like the example I just gave of false presuppositions around conspiracy theories and stuff like that from innocent questions. Um, so I think that's my nightmare scenario involves there was really interesting research that was done by my second supervisor during my PhD actually that shows the way that like even like bots and stuff can influence online communities. And he basically showed how easy it is for a majority opinion to appear to be a minority opinion in a bunch. He just sort of like human computer interaction research. So basically that like you can have it be like 5% of people have like a really radical like like white supremacist or something opinion, and then you have 95% of people who don't. That's a larger percentage than I would even like, but let's say you have that. But then if you have the ability to have like semi-automated or automated injections from that 5%, then it will slowly silence the 95% because they will perceive themselves to be in a minority opinion because the volume of their like speech has been drowned out, and then people like just kind of stop sharing. And he's like shown this by a bunch of experiments, and that sort of thing is something I think about a lot actually, that just sort of like imbalances in that can be done via automated tools can really change people's perceptions of how valid their opinion is, and also change how much they speak up. And I think that can really destabilize a lot of the way our society currently works, actually, like politically, from everything from like what companies think of public opinion to how legitimate people think different political policies are and that sort of stuff. So that's one of my nightmares. And then the other nightmare I have is that usage of language models will happen faster than mitigations of like conspiracy theories and stuff like that will happen. Usage will grow faster than the mitigations can, and education both can catch up, and a bunch of people will end up uh, basing a lot of opinions for a couple of years until it catches up around like really badly false information, which is a different side of the same coin but doesn't require bad actors.
Let's talk about these two separately. I'm afraid I can provide an example to your nightmare scenario in a real life. Because I've been observing the social media space since the Russian aggression on Ukraine. Being based out of Poland, we are extremely close to the conflict, and we have friends that are victims of this conflict, or somehow are impacted one way or another. We have also a lot of people migrating from Ukraine to Poland. Sometimes even Russians. There are a bunch of Russians that migrated just to escape the reality they don't have impact on. And Polish software startups dedicated their time to observe the space and sort of catch the misinformation campaigns. Uh, and to my horror, I noticed that there were instances, for example, of bots on Instagram that were populating certain accounts, or were generating content as accounts, content that was negative, had a negative sentiment towards Ukrainian refugees in Polish reality. They're stealing jobs, they're impacting our economy. It's they require constant support, etc., etc. And they were shutting down those accounts. They were, uh, making sure that Instagram knows that this is fake and that this is harmful. But there were plenty of accounts like this that they found. So that was exactly what you're talking about, right? Like, just trying to manipulate the social opinion by just infusing it with so much of that particular content that you want to, steer people's anger, or just push the sentiment in a certain direction, just by the sheer, brute force of having lots of sophisticated bots spit out a lot of that type of language and opinions.
Yeah. Yeah, it's and that's yeah, it's that is exactly my nightmare scenario, and it's tricky. It's like there are things that I think the community needs to do, like my community of like LLM creators needs to do better, that we're working on, but like I think we could be spending a lot more time on trying to make bot bot text detectable, like things that are generated, because of course like there are like technical ways you can do this, and we spend some amount of time on it, but we could spend way more time, and I think we need to spend way more time on all of the various ways of detecting generated text so that it makes this sort of thing easier. But there are also a bunch of like old things, like old techniques that I think need to also be used more. Like, detecting bots is not a new thing. The quality of their text is a new thing, but a bunch of things can be detected from behavior and stuff like that, which is, I'm sure, some what some of these startups are doing. So I think some combination of this, but yeah, I think we need to, as a society, do a lot more on it, because even though like I worry and I spend a lot trying to make sure that I can detect this sort of usage with Cohere, it's like fundamentally it's because I don't want it to exist in the world. So if I do it and then and then some other person doesn't, then you kind of end up with the same problem, right?
Definitely. Well, I paradoxically, I am optimistic, even though I see those examples in front of me. And the reason for that is, I mentioned that in the conversation with Elaine Gao. She was my first guest on a podcast. The reason is that we have much more scrutiny on our hands as an LLM space, and we won't get away with cutting corners. Basically, there will be news outlets, internet forums that will show us the examples in front of our very eyes and force us to get better. So that, I hope, will our will to do great is one thing, but the second thing is just public scrutiny, and the fact that we need to deliver, and we need to be really mindful about this as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think the amount that AI stuff is in the public image is beneficial in this case and is different than, I would say, like, I mean, social media was popular, but it didn't it didn't garner the same attention from like politicians and stuff in its early days, right? That AI is in what is actually pretty much, I mean, obviously like language models have been around forever, but early days of language models of this size. Um, so yeah, and I think that that is a major difference that I agree it could galvanize quite a lot of action from most sectors.
Do you think that a progress can be slowed or curated or shaped to our liking somehow?
Um, like like the directions that we're taking language models in, or yeah. Um, yes and no. Like I think well, I think you always to some extent have the engine of capitalism where like everyone like I can choose to make the world's like nicest model, I suppose. But if it doesn't also beat competition, then it doesn't actually make the world that much better, right? So I have to like simultaneously do both. So some amounts of things are not super controllable because of market forces. So like for so some amount of like the speed that of which you have to grow in order to like continually get better and better at common use cases that make you profitable and stuff is like not something that I think is feasible to do anything about, because even if one person like is like, okay, I'm going to slow down, I'm going to do more interpretability, like someone else will just go faster and then they'll get more market share. um and it will still be like, you could say, okay, from an ecosystem standpoint, as long as that person who slowed down survives, um then they can contribute to understanding, which then will be used by everyone else, and that's valuable. And so that is true, there is that in between. But it's a risky game to play to make sure that you can survive while you do that. And also in the interim, a whole bunch of things will happen, because the reason that people aren't spending as much time on it is it's much slower. It's like that level of like research and understanding is super slow. So super rewarding, but super slow. But I think on the converse side, I think when we like these sort of market forces are driven by public opinion to some extent, like public needs and public opinion. And so I think one of the things that actually has been quite good is the amount that public opinion has lately been concerned about societal harms and stuff to like a larger degree than I think I've seen very much in the past, which means that it does still become like market necessary to do good things. And I think there are a lot of people like me and other people at our company and a lot of other people in the space, like loads of us, who, have seen the sort of the evolution of NLP and both the new capabilities that are really exciting, but also the downsides that come with that over the last many years, and are just extremely motivated to like a lot of people who are super experienced and know this technology really well, who are extremely motivated to make sure that it kind of gets steered in the right direction. And these people can influence public opinion, make actual tech changes. And sometimes even, you always have like collaborations with like not for profits as well, which have like more leeway in lots of ways. Although, like I think the fact that public opinion has been influenced enough to care lately has been actually really beneficial for doing good things at companies.
To that, I totally agree with you. I would add to that it's not necessarily even the market force that's pushing the innovation that we don't seem to be able to stop anytime soon. But it's also people's curiosity. Once a certain capability is discovered, it's really hard not to look in that direction and be excited about it and try to get the most of it in terms of your projects. And when you look at open source community and how fast people are building stuff there and discovering stuff there, it's mind-blowing. And there's no market force there really. I mean, of course, to some extent is, because you have, I don't know, companies like Meta that are also releasing open source models, but a lot of that is just like the community of builders, of makers that really really want the best of the best models. And somehow, we are in this race, all of us, and we all want to do the best. And also, that another thing is that you get used to the best of the best, and then you want more. That's another aspect of our nature, I think. You're just like, like when I was writing the book about GPT-3, I was thinking that it's unfathomable. Like what the hell happened in the text space that I'm able to generate a list of ingredients for a salad or something with a model. And now, like 2 years later, it seems extremely trivial, and you constantly want more, and you have different modalities, and the GPT-4 performance just insane. You have also multilingual capabilities now. There's so many new things that are so stimulating, and it's really hard to stop. I feel like stop to push and stop to look for more.
Yeah, no, I that's a really good counterpoint. I really like that you said that actually, because especially because I've noticed like I don't know, in my role of day to day, like worrying about stuff, which is like to some extent my job, like doing research, but also like, anticipating what can go wrong. I can sometimes tend toward the slightly cynical. But no, that's totally true. And I've definitely been like, I've yeah, I have been part of different open source communities, and I've been in loads of places where people are essentially just donating their free time and getting nothing out of it, and they get a huge amount of innovation because of like inherent drive and curiosity, and that's the sweeter side of the same effect. Yeah.
So there was a second nightmare scenario that you mentioned, and this one was more in the realm of accidentally influencing people's perspective on the world. As companies and as communities developing LLMs, we seem to have this insane power in our hands right now, where people start to use our LLMs instead of web search browsers, for example, and use them to dig up some facts about the world. Try to, this is something that my boyfriend did that was a really funny example of ChatGPT failing designing our itinerary when we were traveling, and just turned out that he wanted a beautiful sunset at the end of the day, and we ended up at the other side of the coast where there was no sunset whatsoever. But like people let this technology penetrate their lives so deeply to such an extent. And so I totally understand why you're worried about this, but I can tell you as well that it's not only us. Again, something is happening in the tech space generally, where things are happening faster than we can act. And I hear from parents some nightmare scenarios realized where a kid is exploring their iPad and they're watching YouTube, and randomly on their playlist there is some video about UFO appearing, and like evidence for it, very emotional, very persuasive commentary, etc., etc. And then this 8-year-old kid doesn't have the mental tools to guard themselves against it, and to fact check it, cross check it, etc., and to even doubt it. And so they end up believing in it like hardcore. But this is just like access to our information right now. This is internet, basically. This is information being available out there, and it's super super tricky to solve. But what do you see being done there, or what would you like to see being done there?
Like in order to do it really well, which is what we'll need to do it like really well. We can make a certain amount of traction on it by both like implementation and research by spending time on more data and more evaluation and also like more research into better ways of dealing with it. But I think fundamentally, in order to get the sort of coverage that I will feel comfortable with, we'll also have to do a like kind of more participatory design type work than I think has been historically so much the case, where we actually really engage with like pretty diverse communities of people and study their usage patterns and let them give us feedback and that sort of thing. Because I've just, like I've been in NLP since well, I guess like I did my first NLP project in 2014, but I've been really seriously when on like a machine translation thing back in statistical MT before neural models.
So old school, by the way.
Very old school. Yeah. Back in statistical MT, we thought we didn't need any new models. We're like, we just need more data. It'll be fine. Genuinely. Like our models keep getting bigger. We have 5 grams. Um, yeah. But I've been like really seriously in it since like 2017. But even from before, like, but then I was in tech for like 5 years before I started sailing. And so I've just seen from like not just like NLP, but even just normal like tech world how often you've ended up with, like really large oversights from just not having a diverse enough set of population that was like testing your stuff. And sometimes it's more benign. Like when I was at Google, there were like a bunch of major features that just didn't work if you had like Yahoo accounts or something when they rolled them out. And it was because nobody had like who had tested it had like tested with anyone who used one, even though like a huge percentage of the population still had them. So like that's like a really benign example. And but then less benign examples are when you don't catch like when Twitter didn't catch that it was censoring that it's like that like a bunch of the content moderation was censoring African American dialects because they hadn't like tested it and it had too many false positives. So like just a bunch of African American people just like couldn't use Twitter. Um and so that's like much less benign, but both of them sort of come from the same like having an insufficiently diverse group of people testing your software, and so you not like mentally anticipating like all the possible usage patterns. So I think it's we're going to have, and that sort of thing is like it's almost like not really a tech thing, so it's not even my area of expertise, but I think fundamentally we're going to need a lot more like community involvement and engagement in order to get good at this. But there is the community interest at the moment, I think, so there's some amount of inertia that will help us do that.
I love that. Well, I can think of the Aya open source project by Cohere for AI, and the need to make sure that there is a fair representation for as many languages out there as possible, the dialects, the different types of ways people communicate, just to be able to use the models in a fair way and in your own circumstances as well. I love that one. Okay, so we went into the dark space. I want to uh, do a counterweight of going a little bit into the prescriptive space. So you know a lot about the different pitfalls that we can enter when we are interacting with LLMs. On the pragmatic level, I love this metaphor that Luis Serrano, my manager, hello Luis, I really appreciate you if you're listening to this. He told me basically about uh, trying to understand it in terms of there are three players when it comes to LLMs and interacting with them. There is LLM provider, there is third-party developer using this model, and then there's the user. And in this metaphor, the LLM provider is the provider of electricity. The third-party developer is the oven, so the agent that builds the tool that will be utilizing this electricity for something specific. And then at the end, there is a cook, and the cook is the user. And it's up to the cook not to get burnt, for example, by this electricity that they are dealing with. And so there are these three layers, it seems, and also there are different stages of you have stage of model development, you have also the stage of model in production. So there are these different stages as well where we can do different things to make to increase or to decrease the safety and security risks associated with LLMs. Let's talk about those.
Yeah, like talking about what makes sense for what stages or
Yes.
yeah. No, I like that analogy a lot. Because I think it's really good. It ties in a little bit with what we were talking about earlier about, like potential and like earlier the analogy you came up with was the gene expression one. Um and environmental factors. And I think electricity works similarly too. Of like an electricity provider does have some control, right? Like they can prevent like super wild surges. They can prevent random outages, all of which might cause like really big, safety problems. If they have random outages, that's a really big problem for a hospital. If they have lots of surges, that can cause fire problems. Like, so they do have some responsibilities and some control, but then there's loads of stuff that they have no control of, like the oven settings and the design of the oven that makes it more or less easy to burn yourself. And then there's the education aspect of like teaching the cook not to touch the hot part of the oven. um, and definitely all of these play in. Yeah, from an LLM angle, I think the best part we can do is provide like information to some extent, like a lot of our responsibility at the moment. And I don't think that'll necessarily like always be true, because but at the moment we're the repositories of a lot of the knowledge of like, it's, if you're going to go with the analogy, the knowledge of like the voltage and what that means and like how you have to design things because of the voltage. So we're the repositories of like what our models are really good at doing, what they're not really good at doing, what's pretty risky to do with them. And so it's our responsibility to to make that information available to the developers of the ovens and the apps and everything else, and then to work with them actually, I think, and help them like mitigate it sometimes, because we're the repositories of knowledge and because it's quite new. Um, and then I think it's their responsibility to do some level of evaluation, because, like I discussed earlier, their data can bring out potential. I if their data is biased enough, any language model that possesses information will become biased. And so similarly, if you design an oven badly enough, such that, I don't know, it has hot coils everywhere and like, and the door handle is conductive, like, um, then then the electricity company can't do anything about it. So so a huge amount of their responsibility will be one with, I think, given the tools we have helped them with, given the information and the transparency we have given them, a huge responsibility for them will be to then like do some design and evaluation on their side, to mitigate any of their use case specific safety stuff. Because the safety needs, as with this analogy, the safety needs of um, an oven are super different than the safety needs of a hospital electricity grid, as far as like what can go wrong, and that's something that the developer needs to be an expert in to some extent, and then they can do this like triage thing with our capabilities, um, but to some extent, we need to have their understanding of what the really bad scenarios are for using their product, and then we can do some things on our side and some things need to be done on their side. But otherwise, if we're doing it, then we're just armchair theorizing to some extent. So then that's their responsibility, and yeah, and I think we'll get the user education thing. I mean, eventually, I think everyone's going to be trying to do that, because I think you can't get around the fact that user education is going to be important. Like, we're going to have to teach users to rely on models for some types of things and not for others. In a principle, I never like pushing things onto the user. I think it's like to some extent unfair. Like, well, because it's almost like well designed things are like easy to use for humans, right? Like, and loads of tools that we use in the world fall into that category. And so I don't like that. But also there are, like when search first came out and stuff like that, people did really have to learn to use it, and they had to learn about how to tell what a reliable source was and what a reliable source wasn't and stuff. And there's growing pains from that, and I would like for us and the app developers to do as much as possible to not put as much onto the user, but I think we can't avoid putting something onto the user, and we can help try provide that education, but I think we will feel some growing pains about that no matter what, I think.
Yeah, I can imagine. Something that comes to mind for myself is the transition, because I'm of this generation, transition from big clunky mobile phones that when you drop them, nothing happens really because they're so sturdy, versus our sophisticated, beautiful smartphones with very delicate screens that once you drop them, there is a consequence to pay. And well, yes, we learn that through engaging with the object and learn to do smarter things with it, etc. But part of it is just putting it out there and seeing what happens.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yes, I'm of the same generation, and I now need a new phone every 2 years. So I clearly haven't learned, but but I think maybe some people are faster learners than me.
I mean, there's an entire new market for this. There are places where you can exchange your smartphone screen, for example. So, like, it can bring bread to the table for some people right now. So, not necessarily such a bad thing. uh, yeah, but on the more serious note, are there things that are pretty universal that you would like developers to know, or people, companies that are choosing to work with LLMs, that they what is the checklist of things that that they should consider, no matter the provider, no matter whether it's, well, okay, open source versus uh, access to the cloud API could be a different thing, but also maybe private deployment, not necessarily open source, could be a private deployment from a LLM provider. Okay, again, too complex of a question, but
No, I get it.
what's the prescription here?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I think I really want people to start becoming aware of is that some types of safety issues are like point-wise, meaning they can be detected from one interaction, and some are distributional. So in the example of where we were worrying about gender bias earlier, that's actually inherently distributional. Like if you have a model that is summarizing resumes for you, and it badly summarizes one woman's resume, then that is not something you can detect as a potential safety problem. But if it regularly summarizes women's resumes worse over the entire distribution of resumes you look at, if it significantly summarizes women's resumes worse than men's resumes, then that is a safety problem. So whereas some things can be detected immediately, like if you have a situation that you're using your model for some sort of like story writing and it does like really negative stereotypes of certain people, like it has really negative stereotypes for women or for gay people or like any demographic, um then like you can detect that immediately, right? Like you can have an example and it shows you a super negative stereotype of this person, which we call representational harm, like it negatively influences public opinion of this group. Then like, and so I think I would, and sometimes when I notice people only thinking of one of them, and you have to test for them pretty differently, right? Like the distributional one, you actually need to test over, and similarly, like I already gave the sort of like Twitter content moderation one with African American dialects earlier, where like again you wouldn't be able to tell with one because false positives do exist. You have, like, you build any system and it will have errors. The safety problem is when the errors are systematic, and they become like worse for particular groups and end up disenfranchising them as a result. So I think having an awareness that both types of harms can exist and that you need to test for them differently, which I already said, is I think maybe one of my main ones. Um, yeah, I think related to the distributional thing, I think it's that some harms can sort of inherently come from scale, and so some responsibility. I don't mean scale of your model, I mean scale of a system. Um, in that minor errors when they're like replicated across many things can be a problem. So we've seen this in more traditional ML as well before large language models, and they will be replicated in large language models where if you like for instance, I'll just continue using my resume as example. Loads of people for a while were like, well, okay, so you get some gender bias in an automatic hiring thing, but like humans have it as well, right? And they do. And one of the reasons, not all fairness issues come from data. Actually, that's like a lot of people like to say that. I mean, fairness issues do come from data, but they do not come from only data. Um, they can also come from your choice of like decoding parameters and like that sort of thing. But a lot of the data is often replicating human biases. Like this is one of the reasons why you have imbalanced data to begin with, that makes you less likely to hire like minority populations, let's say, for certain types of STEM roles or something. It's true, but the really big difference is that like you don't have one human reading all resumes, so that single bias and like fairness problem is not replicated across the entire industry. Whereas, the idea of a lot of these things we develop is maybe they won't be replicated across the entire industry because you have three competitors, but you've essentially still narrowed it down to three decision-making algorithms. So um, even if you have a minor bias for against certain minority groups, it will be a much bigger problem now that it's been automated than it was when you had humans, because the sort of unreliability and variation of humans was in that particular regard a benefit, right? Because like it means someone couldn't get a job at a certain place because they had a bunch of you know ideas about like women in STEM that were really like negative, stereotypical, and from a long time ago. But then someone at a different company won't have that idea, um, because of the human variation. So I think one of the other things I'd say to keep in mind is when you get more like market share and something is deployed more broadly, I think you have more responsibility to make sure that your models really don't have differing behavior for different populations.
As a business leader at an organization or tech leader, trying to looking at LLMs from a little bit of a distance, but like more and more fondly and thinking, okay, maybe now's the time to start testing stuff. What do I do? The first three steps.
Yeah. So look at if you're fine tuning, which I think most people are, because even a small amount of fine tuning data really helps performance. Look at your data. Make sure that there aren't any like spurious correlations in it that might be correlated with any populations. So this can be easy or it can be hard, but like you can do like you know, looking at spurious correlations is not that complicated. You can look at like mutual information between like labels and demographic features if you have any of the demographic features. If you don't, for whatever privacy reasons, because often people don't, you can often use sort of like really standard clustering algorithms. Like there's some variations on k-means basically. There's a good paper called Logan, that came out that was really, it's just like helpful. It's like a short paper on like how to modify k-means to make it best for doing this. But basically, if you don't actually have demographic labels, you can essentially discover them by clustering. And so you can look at and so you can basically then detect if whatever system you've built is behaving super differently for these different groups. So I would say just start with an evaluation of looking at like good performance and bad performance, whatever that means for you. If you're doing some type of classification, or if you're doing some type of generation, then bad performance can sometimes be human. It can sometimes be a proxy. Like you'll usually have some sort of automated metric, right, of which a proxy sometimes by using a classification model, or sometimes by using a reward model, usually by using another model that's a proxy for a human. So just look at good performance and bad performance, and cluster it by inputs, and then just look at it and see if you can find, because you'd be able to notice, like if you had if Twitter had done that with their content moderation, they would have noticed that one of the clusters was African American dialect and it wasn't anywhere else. Um, so I think that's really the first thing to do. And you can do that at inference time if you've already made your product. If you haven't already made it, just you can do it by looking at your fine tuning data. So and looking at basically the same thing. So I think that's the first step, and I think that will tell you, that will be like sort of like set you up to be like way better than I think many people are doing. I think many people are not actually doing this. And then once you've done that, if you find that there are some imbalances in your fine tuning data that your language model is likely to exploit, which is like, anything that's above, like 60/40 or something, like anything that's above like anything that's like a significant correlation of certain type, then I would say then you can subsample your data, so that it's more balanced. You can synthetically generate new data. There's a bunch of people who have done this, and that works quite well. Either by using, like, you can get new data is great, but like you can often use synthetic templates, or you can use something like in context learning for a language model and get it to synthetically generate some new data for you. If your model was not as good at summarizing women's resumes, you could feed in a bunch of the like men's resumes, and then and the good summaries from that, and then like say, oh, switch some of these characteristics to women or something like that. And language models are quite good at that, like really good at creating synthetic data nowadays. It's one of the nice things about large language models. And so then if you create, I know it sounds kind of intuitive because you've created it from the language model to begin with, but basically there's sort of two different stages. Like, you're reinforcing certain behaviors of the model with your fine-tuning data. So if you synthetically create a bunch of new good data of summarization of women's resumes, which you've done by doing this sort of like fancy in-context learning thing, but with the same model that you already had access to, and then you incorporate that into your fine-tuning data, that can fix it as well.
Incredible. Thank you so much for the prescription. I'm going to make sure to summarize it and make it available for folks out there. And for coming and for chatting with me. I know we're at time and you have a thing to attend. It's been such a blast chatting with you about all these different crazy things from all these different angles. I love your mind, and thank you for bringing it here for a little bit and, getting in touch.
Absolutely. It's been a blast. I have really enjoyed the diversity of topics. It has been great.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Remember to rate the podcast at whatever platform you chose to listen to it. Let me know what you'd like to see in the future. Let me know what you particularly liked about the episode that you've just listened to. I'm all ears. You can follow me on my socials at it's Sandra Kublik, and get a personal scoop on this episode on my Substack at it's Sandra Kublik. Both of these can be found in the show notes. I'll see you next time. Take care.